Hi friends, so now we're beginning with integrated neurology. This is one of the highest yield systems of medicine in my opinion, because you do get a lot of clinical questions, and if your neuro is strong, it actually gives you a very strong edge over the others, because a lot of the questions, especially in INICT, can get very tricky, and only if your concepts are strong and you studied in an integrated fashion, you could solve a lot of these questions. So personally, this is one of my favorite things to study. Neurology has always been, and hopefully also to teach and also to learn, it'll be good. So let's go for it. We are starting off with something from neurophysiology, or maybe general physiology, which is very important. That is about the sensory receptors, and then we'll talk about the nerves as well. Both of these are very important, and they get you at least one question in the exam. Okay, so first let's talk about all of the sensory receptors that we have. So we divide them into their adaptation. How fast do they act? So we divide them into fast and slow. In fast, what you want to remember is Miss Pac-Man. Do you remember the video game Miss Pac-Man? Yeah, who used to go around chasing and eating those dots. So with Miss Pac-Man, you had to be very fast, isn't it, in order to avoid getting eaten. So that's how you remember that fast receptors are Miss Pac-Man. So you want to remember Miss say Meissner, and Pac say you want to remember Pacinian corpuscles. Alright, so this is very important. Meissner and Pac-Man. Apart from that, because it regulates hair movement, these are the hair end organs that we have. Okay, so these are also acting fast. So these are the three fast adapting receptors that we have. Now let's talk about their features, which is also something which is tested. So Meissners are the most numerous receptors that we have. They're only present on non-hairy skin, and you want to remember fast, so they regulate fast movement, touch, and 2-point discrimination. 2-point discrimination, maximum in the lips, minimum in the back. We'll also study this when we go to stroke localization. Okay, so this is maximum in the lips, minimum in the back. Okay, so this is about Meissners. Pacinian corpuscles can be asked as an image based question. So this is this onion ring disc kind of a thing. It is the largest receptor. Because it is largest, obviously it's the most sensitive, and this regulates vibration, high frequency vibration. So here you can see how Meissner and Pacinian are both located in the dermis. Very unlikely for Meissners to be asked for identification, but Pacinian is something which is very important. Now talking about the slow receptors. So when we go to the slow receptors, focus on E here. Epidermal, the only epidermal receptor, helps us palpate the edges better. So that is why it helps in Braille. This is very controversial, wherein certain resources say Meissner, certain say Merkel. Merkel is slightly better to be marked than Meissner in my opinion, but there is no correct answer here, okay, because both are important. So what is this that we are talking about? When I say only epidermal, all E's coming in, 2 E's in the name, Merkel. So you can see this is the Merkel's disc. In fact, in Dermat also I've taught you this, how these Merkel receptors are present in the stratum basale, right? That's where we have 2M's, melanocyte and Merkel cells. So these are those Merkel cells. Apart from that, the other slow receptor, very important, is the Ruffini's corpuscle. So this is also slow, and this regulates pressure, stretch, and this is the one which is maximum in joint capsule. So this regulates stereognosis and proprioception as well. Okay, apart from that, what regulates slow pain and itching? These are your C-type fibers. So these are your nerve endings which are your C-type fibers. Remember, SIR says slow pain, and this is via SIR says substance P. So all SIRs are gonna stick together here. Okay, so these are your slow receptors. So this is about receptors. Now let's talk about the nerve fibers. Again, very important. So I'm going to teach you the Erlanger-Grasser classification, where we divide the fibers into A, B, C. A is further classified into A, alpha, beta, gamma and delta. The Lloyd and Hunt counterpart of this is 1A, 1B, 3 and 4, but the more accepted is what is the alpha, beta, gamma, delta is what we want to remember. So now alpha. From alpha, you want to remember this alpha male who's going to the gym and has built a very nice body. So with that, you want to remember body, somatic motor. All right, so it's build a lot of muscles. So that helps you remember alpha is somatic motor, and also it helps you remember our bodies are on property. Yeah, so from property you want to remember proprioception. Okay, so somatic motor and proprioception. Alpha male's good body is his own property. Okay, and how did he build that property? He built it by lifting a lot of heavy weights, as heavy as 120 kg. So this is how you can remember conduction velocity is the fastest for the alpha male, 120 kg, 120 meter per second, and from 120 only you can remember 12 to 20 is the diameter. This is not needed, but for some reason I think you will now remember this. Alright, so 120 and 12 to 20 is what you want to remember about A alpha fibers. Then we go to A beta fibers. So with beta fibers, I want you to imagine a very nice relaxing massage that you're getting after you're done with your exams. So with the massage, what is involved? You're going to remember you have touch and you have pressure. Yeah, so touch and pressure is beta. Beta means bath. After the exam ke baad is massage time. Okay, then you have a gamma. With gamma you want to remember Hulk. Hulk got exposed to gamma rays or something. Yeah, and Hulk has a lot of muscles, isn't it? So you want to remember this is muscle, spindle, efferent, that is gamma. Delta is fast pain. Remember we did slow pain with C fibers. So delta is fast pain and also cold. So you want to remember it's very cold outside and you want to run back to your home very quick. So fast pain, cold temperature is delta. Apart from that, B is going to be preganglionic autonomic, whereas C is all of the remaining things. So warm temperature, slow pain and postganglionic. So very important, all of the other things are C. So say slow pain is what is the most important. Delta is fast pain. Here this is via substance P, whereas fast pain is via glutamate. This is also a repeat question. Okay, other velocity, diameter, no need to remember. Then comes the real questions which I have listed for you. So cold sensation, as we saw, is the A delta with fast pain. Warm burning pain and freezing pain is type C, remember. Then the sensitivity to local anesthetic is something that's again very controversial, because physiology textbooks say something else and anesthesia textbooks say something else, but I believe we have to give it to the physiology textbooks. That's what is my opinion, but you are free to follow whatever. So what I have is gamma delta. So whenever you look at this question, you are like, God, this again? So that's what you are gonna remember, God, gamma and delta. Alright, so that's the most sensitive fibers that you wanna remember. Then pressure, very important. Whenever you are under a lot of pressure, like you are in your exams, what would I tell you? Just stick to your basics. What is basics? Basics is ABC. So that's what the nerve receptors also do. When in pressure, follow the basics, ABC. Then hypoxia. Whenever there's hypoxia, the nerve endings go, let's run from here. They will go bhago. So from bhago, you want to remember bako. So that is BAC. Alright, so that's how you remember that hypoxia is BAC. So this is about our nerve fibers. Now we go on to sleep physiology. Very, very, very important. So you have sleep disorders in psychiatry, you have sleep physiology, very important for the exam point of view. So we start off with the basic EEG waves that we have. So you want to remember, the higher the frequency, lower will be the amplitude. Frequency and amplitude are inversely proportional. So the ones which have highest frequency and lowest amplitude is not the beta but the gamma waves. You have something known as gamma waves as well. After that you have beta. Then you have the alpha waves, theta waves and delta waves. So what you want to remember, good bat dance. You saw bat dance very well, okay? So you saw a good bat dance. So in increasing order of amplitude, you have gamma waves, beta, alpha, theta and delta, and as you go down the frequency keeps reducing, alright? So this is how you remember all of the waves. When do you have gamma waves? Let's say I tell you right now to calculate 15 into 6 plus 9. You are doing a problem solving, all of your brain is invested into that. So whenever you are solving a problem, you are gonna be having gamma waves. Hopefully right now, maybe not gamma, but you have beta waves. So when you are giving full attention to the class, you are in beta waves. Eventually, maybe right now you're in beta, but eventually after 5 or 6 hours, your eyes are gonna start closing. You are awake, but your eyes start closing. That is alpha. So alpha for awake, yes, you have not yet slept, but your eyes are starting to close. Eventually you're gonna go into sleep, and once you've slept, in the N1 phase of your sleep, you're gonna have theta waves, and in your deep sleep, which is gonna be in N3 phase, you're gonna have delta waves. So delta is D for deep sleep. Alright, so this, I hope none of you is in deep sleep. Even if you are, you wouldn't know. So this is the good bat dance for the EEG waves and their frequency and their identification. Now you will get a question on, in different sleep stages, what are the waveforms that you get. Okay, so when we are awake, paying attention, like right now we have beta waves, eyes start closing, alpha waves. So now once you sleep, you are in the non-REM sleep. Non-REM sleep has three phases: N1, N2, N3. N1 is the early phase where you go into BAT. So far we are following the BAT rule, you are having theta waves. N2 is the one where you spend maximum amount of your time in. Alright, so this is the phase of sleep where you spend maximum amount of time. This is sleep spindle and K complexes. So this is also something that has been tested a lot of times. So two things in N2. So you have K complex, which kind of looks like an inverted K. Yeah, so when it looks like an inverted K, that is K complex, and when you see these spindle like things, that is your sleep spindle. So remember, both of these things you can be asked to identify it also. These are seen in N2. In N3, that is the deep sleep, you have delta waves. Now this is your non-REM sleep. Yeah, so this is non-REM sleep, and then you have your rapid eye movement sleep or paradoxical sleep. Why this is known as paradoxical sleep is because now you have beta waves. Technically you're sleeping, but still your brain is on fire, it is working. So that is beta waves, this is REM, and maybe this is the reason why this is also very important for memory processing. Yeah, so that's why for the exams, you can't just keep studying for 24 hours. A good restorative sleep is very, very important for you to remember stuff, for it to go into your long-term memory, right? So never ever compromise on your sleep, you know. So take it from me, I never slept for less than 7 hours at least, you know. Till date, I try to get 7 to 8 hours. It's not always possible, but sleep is very important when you're studying, you know. Your mind needs that rest in order to function the next day and have that efficacy. All right, so coming back, REM sleep, you're gonna have beta waves. Now, because you're having rapid eye movement, remember you're also gonna have PGO. PGO is basically pontogeniculo-ocular waves. So these are probably the waves which are causing the ocular rapid eye movement. Alright, so this is about the different sleep stages and the waveforms. Let's just do the disorders right here, right now. Okay, so what you want to remember, in N2, you have two sets of teeth. So that is bruxism, tooth grinding. Bruxism is N2. N3, you have all of the other disorders like sleepwalking. You will have nocturnal enuresis, or you could have night terrors. This is very, very important, the difference between nightmares and night terrors. So REM sleep is where you have nightmares. So you want to remember nightmares. Mares means memory. Do you remember those days when you suddenly wake up feeling very scared because you had a bad dream? Now when somebody asks you what happened, you are not able to remember. You know something bad happened, but you can't recall the dream. That means you had night terror. But when you remember everything, that there's a ghost who was coming in, he was coming to eat, and then suddenly I woke up, that is nightmare. So nightmare means it can be recalled. Alright, so you want to remember nightmare has memory. Memory means REM. So that's how you're not gonna confuse these two. Alright, so this is about the different disorders in different sleep cycles. Now we go on to the various changes in the sleep cycle in different conditions. Like with age, as the age keeps increasing, the REM sleep time overall reduces, N3 also reduces. So the deep sleep and REM sleep both reduce as you grow older. Then you want to remember what happens in depression. In depression, you have higher REM sleep time overall, plus the REM latency reduces, meaning you're going to go into REM sleep much quicker also, and you're going to spend a lot of time in REM sleep. Alright, so this is what you remember about REM sleep. Apart from that, N3 reduces. Alright, so In elderly and depressed, what is common? They have low deep sleep. They have low restorative sleep. Alright, restorative sleep is N3, deep sleep. Apart from that, you also want to remember depressed patients are gonna have more nighttime awakenings. They are gonna have early morning awakening, which is known as terminal insomnia. Alright, so this is known as terminal insomnia. Apart from that, you want to remember narcolepsy is one more condition where the REM latency is reduced. Alright, so the REM latency reduces here. Look at this graph. This is something which is a repeat INICET question. So here they have given you EEG, EMG and EOG and asked you to interpret what part of the sleep cycle the patient is in. So here you can see beta waves. In addition, in the EMG, you can see how the muscles are moving, yes, and eyes are also moving. So when eyes are moving, muscles are moving and beta waves are happening, that means that the person is awake and active right now. On the other hand, when you see beta waves but the muscle is in atonia, very, very important, and you see rapid eye movement happening. So this is the hallmark of REM. So remember that in REM sleep, the muscles are in a state of paralysis. The muscles are in atonia. So the EMG should show no activity. The EOG will show you activity. You also want to remember, if you measure the heart rate, respiratory rate of the patient, it's all going to be increased because overall the sympathetic outflow increases here. On the other hand, when you see these slow large amplitude waves, these are slow waves, the muscles are moving slightly whereas the eyes are not moving. So this is non-REM sleep. Okay, so non-REM sleep, the muscles do have tone but eyes are not gonna be moving. Okay, so this is about how we interpret this graph, very, very conceptual. Now let's go to basal ganglia. So basal ganglia, very, very important. A lot of students find it very difficult. What you just got to remember is the neurotransmitter here, and then we go to the basal ganglia D1, D2 circuit. Okay, so here what are the parts of basal ganglia? First of all, so you have the caudate nucleus, right? So this is the caudate nucleus. We have already seen this in anatomy. Against the two frontal horns of lateral ventricle, you have caudate. What you see here is the entire lentiform nucleus, which is made up of outer putamen and inner globus pallidus. So putamen, globus pallidus together make the lentiform nucleus, and these are your parts. You will see substantia nigra in the midbrain level. Okay, so here you want to remember this. As far as anatomy goes, these are the two thalamic hemispheres. Okay, so this is our MRI anatomy. Now let's go to the neurotransmitters. So you want to remember all of these in black are gonna be secreting GABA predominantly. So these are all inhibitory in nature. Yeah, so they are all gonna be releasing GABA because they are inhibiting the function of whatever is ahead of them. SNPC, this is the main controller. This is what is gonna decide whether you do the movement or you don't do the movement, whether your action is excited or it's inhibited. Okay, so SNPC, you wanna remember PC, Priyanka Chopra is the main regulator. And what does PC release? SNPC, remember PC is dope. So that's how you remember dopamine. Okay, whereas subthalamic nucleus releases glutamate. Alright, so this is gonna release glutamate. Now coming to the lesions, very, very important question. So when you have a lesion, gonna mark that with red. When you have a lesion in caudate, that is gonna result in chorea. When you have a lesion in GPI, you want to remember gap, that is athetosis. It's this wriggling movement of the finger. GPI, you can remember gap. When you have a lesion in SNPC, substantia nigra, I'm sure you know, Parkinson's disease, there's going to be bradykinesia. When you have a lesion in subthalamic nucleus, it leads to contralateral hemibalismus. Very, very important. Alright, so hemibalismus is this very violent flinging movement that you have. This could be asked as a GIF as well. Very, very important. Chorea, on the other hand, are these purposeless, jerky, dancing like movements which are known as chorea. So these are all of your movement disorders which are very important. Apart from that, you can be asked essential tremors. Remember, essential tremor is familial. It can be reduced with alcohol, and drug of choice is propranolol. Alright, so that's about essential tremor. Now let's talk about the pathway of basal ganglia, very, very important. Okay, so here the main regulator is SNPC, substantia nigra pars compacta. PC is the main regulator which is going to decide whether you have excitatory movement or you have inhibitory pathway which is happening. Okay, so here what you want to remember is there are two kinds of receptors of the dopamine that SNPC is releasing. So if it goes to D1, 1 means excitation, there's gonna be movement which is gonna happen, whereas D2 is the inhibitory pathway. Alright, so D1 is the DI for direct pathway, whereas D2 is IN for indirect pathway. Okay, so this is how you can remember IN. D2 indirect is inhibitory, whereas D1 direct is excitatory. It facilitates movement. So now the dopamine release has happened from the substantia nigra. It's gonna go and bind to the striatum. Striatum meaning it's gonna bind to the caudate and the putamen. Alright, so caudate and putamen together make the striatum. So that's what's gonna decide what happens. Okay. So, if the pathway was excitation, for this I want you to remember one example. Before we go into the pathway, I want you to remember one example here that usually, at least for us girls, our fathers are never gonna say no. Alright, so that's how it is, that if I want something directly, that I want to go to some trip, I know that my dad is gonna say yes, but my mom probably might say no, and my mom might also influence my dad to say no. So ultimately thalamus is the father who's gonna take the call. Now if I directly bypass mom and go to dad saying I want to go to this trip, the movement is gonna be facilitated. So that's the direct pathway, wherein I bypass mother who is GPI. Alright, so that's what you want to remember. GPI is the inhibitory center. So basically what is happening in the D1 direct pathway is directly you are inhibiting GPI. Alright, so GPI is gonna have an inhibitory output. Thalamus has a excitatory output. So how it works is, finally the father, that is thalamus, is going to have an excitatory output on the motor cortex, and here in the center I have GPI. So if I inhibit the inhibitor, are you getting the point? GPI always has an inhibitory output in the form of GABA, like we've already seen. So if I inhibit the inhibitor, eventually the thalamus is going to be activated. So that's what we are doing. We are bypassing. I'm not letting mom know. So you can see how SNC is inhibiting GPI, GPI is inhibiting the thalamus. So we have stopped going to the mother. So this is direct excitatory pathway. I hope you got it. On the other hand, if it reaches mom, if mom is activated, that the girl wants to go on a trip, she's gonna inhibit, right? So if you activate GPI, that is gonna happen via two things, via GPE and STN. If they activate GPI, then this pathway is gonna be an inhibition. Alright, so this is your D2 inhibitory pathway, whereas this is your D1. I hope this makes sense to you. This is the easiest I think I can make this. So this is basal ganglia pathway. This is how it works. Now we go to thalamic nuclei and their functions. Alright, so we are going to study spinal cord tracts also, but ultimately everything relays into the thalamus and then reaches the cortex. Alright, so thalamus is that junction that everybody has to go to. So there are different parts. So first is VPL. VPL, you want to remember, very painful limb. Alright, that's our mnemonic here, very painful limb, meaning it's getting all of the sensations from the body. So the input here is from the spinothalamic and the dorsal columns, that is the medial lemniscus. That is what it's getting all of the sensation from the body. So spinothalamic is going to carry the pain, the temperature, the touch, whereas dorsal column is going to carry the vibration, the proprioception, the crude touch. Eventually it all goes to 312, which is the primary somatosensory cortex. VPM is very painful mouth. So from mouth you want to remember, this is also the sensation. So spinothalamic and dorsal column, which is being carried from the face as well as the taste. Both of these again going to the primary somatosensory cortex. Then comes LGB and MGB. Both of these we have independently studied in opthal and ENT. So L meaning light. So this is gonna carry the visual pathway. So this is the light or vision pathway. So what comes to the LGB? It is gonna be the optic tracts, right? Optic tracts are gonna come to the lateral geniculate body, and the destination here is gonna be the primary visual cortex. Okay, This Brodmann area is 17. We'll talk about this, but roughly you want to remember here that 17 is the age when you start seeing people, yeah? So that's what you want to remember. 17 is visual cortex. Medial geniculate nucleus is the auditory pathway. So M for music. So this is the hearing or the auditory pathway. It comes, you remember the mnemonic which I have told you here, E colima. So this also helps you remember the Bera waves. So E is the 8th cranial nerve, cochlear nucleus, olivary nucleus, lateral lemniscus, inferior colliculus and medial geniculate body. So this is basically carrying the fibers from lateral lemniscus and inferior colliculus, whereas this is superior colliculus. Alright, so C is S, superior colliculus, whereas IC is your auditory pathway. Alright, and this is gonna go to the auditory cortex. Talking about ventral anterior and lateral nucleus, so this is gonna carry all of the motor fibers, alright. So remember the thalamus that was regulating the cortex, who does it get the signal from? So that's gonna be basal ganglia, cerebellum which is giving it the signal, and ultimately the destination is the motor cortex here, alright. So this is how the thalamic nuclei different functions are happening. Now let's just do hypothalamic nuclei functions as well. So remember, lateral nucleus makes you lateral, makes you grow lateral, which is it regulates hunger. So this is the one which is making you hungry. This is the one which is making you angry. So you want to remember hangry here, lateral nucleus. And what is the main stimulus here? The main stimulus is ghrelin. On the other hand, ventromedial is the exact opposite. It is the center for satiety. Yeah, so you are satisfied here, you are no longer hungry, and it's also the reward center of the brain. What activates this is leptin. Alright, so this could be asked to you in an indirect fashion, where if somebody has a lesion in ventromedial, that person is not going to have any satiety. It's going to be always hungry. Okay, so that's how it's asked, but don't get confused. Just remember one thing. Lateral means it makes you grow lateral. It makes you hungry. That's how you'll not get confused. Now, anterior posterior, again pretty confusing, so you want to remember AC. Anterior nucleus causes cooling, whereas posterior nucleus causes heating. So you want to remember that anytime you are in a very hot environment, you want AC, you want anterior nucleus. So anterior nucleus is going to cause a lot of sweating, it's going to cause cooling, whereas posterior nucleus is going to be responsible for heating, it's going to activate the sympathetic system, cause vasoconstriction. Okay, so this is about anterior posterior. Suprachiasmatic nucleus, I am sure you remember, is the main center for determining the circadian rhythm. The main hormone that you want to remember here is melatonin, right? So melatonin is responsible for your circadian rhythm. For supraoptic and periventricular nuclei, what you want to remember is SAD pox. You want to remember SAD pox here. So supraoptic releases ADH, whereas paraventricular releases oxytocin. So these are what are stored in the posterior pituitary as neurosecretory granules, and that's why it appears as a hotspot on T1 weighted. Alright, so that's the radiology correlation here. Finally, we have the preoptic nucleus. This is what is responsible for the sexual response. And you also want to remember that this is what determines the GnRH release. And this is the area that is non-functional in Kallmann syndrome. So this is why in Kallmann syndrome you have anosmia in addition to hypogonadotrophic hypogonadism, because the preoptic nucleus is not working. Alright, so this is about the hypothalamic nuclei. Now talking about cerebellum here. So in cerebellum mostly you get questions about histology. Okay, so you want to remember that there are 5 cells here. Okay, what are the 5 cells? You have stellate cells, you have basket cells. So because they are cells, they are in the molecular layer. Alright, so you want to remember easy: molecular layer, stellate and basket. Purkinje cell layer, no rocket science, you have Purkinje cell. Granular, you have both of the G's. You have Golgi cell and granular cell. So remember, the 2 G cells are in the granular layer. Purkinje cell is in Purkinje cell layer, and molecular layer has the other 2 cells. So this is how you can easily remember. What you want to remember is that every cell is inhibitory except granule cell, which is the only excitatory cell. Alright, so you want to remember granule is special, the only one with excitatory impulse. Then, which is the cell which is going to carry the output? All of these have together decided something, and who is going to tell what they have decided to cerebellar nuclei? It is going to be the Purkinje cell. So, Purkinje cell carries the output to the cerebellar nuclei, which further give the information to the thalamus, which relays it to the cortex like we just saw. Okay. Apart from that, as far as the input goes, that is also a question. So now remember that almost all of the input which is coming from the midbrain, which is coming from the spine, yeah, so your spinocerebellar tracts, rubrocerebellar tracts, your superior cerebellar tracts, all of these inputs are coming via the mossy fibers except the inferior olive. Olivary fibers are the only input for the climbing fibers. Alright, so every input is from mossy fiber except olivary, which is from the climbing fibers. Alright, so this is what is our takeaway. There are 5 cells. Granule is the only excitatory one. Purkinje is the output. Input is via mossy except climbing, which is from olives. Okay, this is what you want to remember. So effectively, can I say what is cerebellum doing? Cerebellum is regulating the movement. It is regulating the posture. The central part of the cerebellum, that is the cerebellar vermis, is going to regulate the central part of the body. That is your truncal balance, yeah, your truncal gait, your truncal balance. Whereas the lateral hemispheres are going to regulate the limbs. They are going to regulate fine movement of the limbs. Alright, so this is what you want to remember. How do you test cerebellar functions? You want to test for movements which are repeated. For example, if I ask the person to do this repeated pronation supination, the person with cerebellar lesion cannot do that. Secondly, if I ask the person that you have to touch my nose, right, the patient needs to touch my nose, the moment he reaches there, he's gonna have an intention tremor. Alright, so this is also known as a finger to nose test. So I'm gonna show you a video of the same. So look at the first image here. We have asked the person to do repeated pronation supination, and look at the kind of incoordination that she is having. Yeah, so this is known as dysdiadochokinesia. So this is known as dysdiadochokinesia. Alright, so this repeated movements of pronation supination is not happening. Look at this chap here. We are asking him to touch this pen. So we have asked, touch the pen and then touch your nose. The moment he is going to touch the nose, he has a tremor. The moment he is going to touch the pen, he has a tremor. So this is what is known as intention tremor. Both of these are signs of a cerebellar lesion. Okay. So now let's talk about all of these neurotransmitters and what happens to them in different diseases. Alright, so this is an integration with almost all of the neurological diseases including psychiatry. Okay, so first of all, let's see the synthesis of different hormones. So acetylcholine is basically the neurotransmitter synthesized in the basal nucleus of Maynard. This is very, very important. Which all? Dopamine is synthesized in the midbrain, so predominantly substantia nigra. We know this because this is the center affected in Parkinson's. GABA is nucleus accumbens, norepinephrine is locus coeruleus, whereas serotonin is the raphe nuclei. So this you have to memorize. This goes into your choti copy. Okay, what happens in different diseases? So you want to remember, in anxiety, GABA and serotonin reduce, whereas norepinephrine increases. One way to remember this is you have a lot of muscle tension, free floating anxiety because of norepinephrine getting increased. And why are you sad? Why are you feeling down in anxiety? Because serotonin is low, right? So you want to remember, low serotonin means sadness. That's how you can remember. So say sadness, so say serotonin. In depression, you want to remember everything is low, right? So norepinephrine is low, serotonin is low, dopamine is low. So this is why we can give SSRI, SNRI, NDRIs, right? So different combinations can be given. So these are the main 3 hormones which are low here. In schizophrenia, only one thing, which is dopamine increase. That is why dopa blockers are given, and they act on the positive symptoms more than the negative symptoms. As far as Alzheimer's is concerned, remember acetylcholine is increased, and that is why we give anticholinergics for Alzheimer's disease treatment. In Alzheimer's, remember acetylcholine is reduced, and that is why we give acetylcholine esterase inhibitors, which increase the cholinergic output in Alzheimer's disease, right? So that is why donepezil is the drug of choice for mild Alzheimer's symptoms. When we talk about Huntington's, you want to remember it is cage, yeah, hunter in the cage. We've done this in general path as well. So CAG, everything in CAG reduces in Huntington. So we have caudate which reduces in size. So there's caudate atrophy, acetylcholine reduces and GABA reduces. So you want to remember that acetylcholine and GABA reduce while dopamine increases. Alright, do remember dopamine increases in Huntington's disease. As far as Parkinson's is concerned, I'm sure you know that dopamine reduces whereas acetylcholine increases, and that is why you give anticholinergic drugs in Parkinson's. Okay, so this is about the different diseases and the neurotransmitters, very important for a general understanding as well. Now let's talk about the approach to dementia. So this is where I've summarized the entire topic of dementia into one table with a lot of path images. So again, neuropath integration is what we're going to be doing. So the most common dementia is Alzheimer's. Yeah, I'm sure you know that. Alzheimer's disease, the main lobes to be involved here is temporal lobe followed by frontal lobe. So you want to remember it is the lobes which are involved, you want to remember it is temporoparietal, and in late stages you have frontal. Alright, so that's why you're gonna see temporoparietal atrophy, and that translates to the function. You lose memory for short-term memory, so temporal lobe, spatial disorientation, so parietal, and later you have personality, that is frontal. So basically the symptoms are just a manifestation of the lobes in that order. Very important question, two apoproteins regulating it. So Alzheimer's with ApoE2 has a good prognosis, whereas E4 is a poor prognosis. So you want to remember too good to be true. Yeah, so that's how you can remember too good to be true. So 2 is good, whereas 4 is bad. So as I said, the drug of choice for mild Alzheimer's is acetylcholine esterase inhibitor, which is donepezil, whereas for severe we want to give NMDA antagonist, that is memantine. Alright, so this is about the treatment. Talking about the path aspect, so you want to remember that there are these three things you want to remember about Alzheimer's. So these are neurofibrillary tangles, NFT. NFT gives you two things more. F for flame cells. So these are known as flame cells, which include the neurofibrillary tangles which have tau protein. Alright, so they have tau protein. These pink bodies are Hirano bodies which consist of actin, and what you are seeing here is the Bile-Shawski stain. Alright, so this is the Bile-Shawski stain that is staining the neuritic plaques. So these neuritic plaques basically have the amyloid beta protein here. The amyloid beta, you want to remember amyloid beta 42 is the main protein that is deposited in Alzheimer's, whereas it is amyloid beta 40 which is the main one implicated in cerebral amyloid angiopathy. That's a vascular disease in elderly patient which presents with a lot of lobar bleeds. Okay, you're going to have intracranial hemorrhage. So this is about the three pathological things in Alzheimer's. Then if they give you stepwise decline with early executive white matter changes on MRI. So MRI is the investigation of choice here. This is vascular dementia. So this is because of small vessel disease which causes these small foci of demyelination in the white matter, which results in a stepwise decline in function as well as memory. Okay, so this is vascular dementia, something very common which we see in the MRIs. Okay, then when you have early personality changes, so this tells you that frontal lobe is what is first involved. You're also having apathy, disinhibition, compulsive disorder, so predominantly frontal. So the name only starts from frontal, so this is frontotemporal dementia or Pick's disease. What you see here, look at this atrophy. It is this knife-like atrophy that you can see. Look at frontal and look at parietal. So there is marked atrophy of the frontal lobe, and these bodies are, no surprise, Pick bodies in Pick's disease. What is very important is you remember this is a tauopathy again. So this is tau with ubiquitin. That's the composition of the Pick bodies. When you have this typical history of Parkinson's with visual hallucinations, fluctuating cognition and REM behavior disorder, you can also have Capgras syndrome which we've studied in psychiatry associated with this. This is dementia with Lewy bodies. Alright, so dementia with Lewy bodies, surprise, you're gonna get Lewy bodies. Lewy bodies are consisting of alpha-synuclein, very important. Then the triad, the typical triad, which is the Hakim's triad of wet, wacky, wobbly. Wet meaning the person has urinary incontinence. Wacky meaning person has ataxia. What kind of gait? Remember, this is a shuffling gait, also known as a magnetic gait, also known as gait apraxia. The hallmark here is it is like Parkinson's gait in a lot of ways. Basically, there's gonna be shuffling, means you're taking these short steps, but the arm swing here is preserved. The arm swing meaning when you're walking, your arms are swinging, that's preserved in NPH, whereas in Parkinson's that is lost. Okay, so this is the triad: wet, wacky, wobbly is the ataxia, whereas wacky is because of the dementia, right? So that is wet, wacky, wobbly. That is the Hakim's triad of NPH, normal pressure hydrocephalus. So the hallmark radiologically in NPH is the fact that the ventricles are going to show you a lot of dilatation, but there is no atrophy. The sulci are normal, alright. So the sulci are not dilated. It's just the ventricles which are dilated, and because of that, these cortical fibers anteriorly get compressed, and that is what is responsible for these symptoms such as urinary incontinence and the frontal apraxic gait. So I'm just gonna take a moment and again show you the videos which are very important here. So look at these two patients here. In the first one, you can see how the patient is again taking these shuffled steps, but the arm swing is normal. Yeah, you can see he's swinging the arms normally. Whereas when you see this shuffling gait, this freezing sort of gait with a stooped posture, the arms are also frozen. This is the typical gait of Parkinson's, which is described as the shuffling gait. So this is NPH. Typical name would be a freezing or a magnetic gait with preserved arm spring, whereas Parkinson's is shuffling gait with a stooped posture with lost arm swing. Okay, so this is about the gaits. Going forwards, you do expect a lot of these questions based on media and GIFs once India figures out the tech to do this. So I think we, should learn this way, and even like for your concept, it's very nice if you can learn this. So I am planning to take a few live sessions as well, wherein we can integrate these GIFs and these videos as well. Okay, so now coming back to the final diagnosis of dementia, wherein you have behavioral changes, myoclonus is going to be very rapidly progressive. Hallmark is CSF 1433. This is a heat shock protein which is going to be positive, or on EEGs you see these periodic sharp wave complexes. This is your prions disease. So the most common prion disease that we see is Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So you want to remember, in prions, these are proteins in which there is an improper folding. Alright, so what we see is this PRPSC abnormally folded protein which is resistant to protease, and it's infective. So this is also known as spongiform encephalopathy. So you can see these empty spaces. So this is spongiform encephalopathy. On the MRI, you can see the pulvinar nucleus, which is the dorsomedial nucleus of the thalamus, appearing hyperintense. This is known as the pulvinar sign. So this is also called as the hockey stick sign. So pulvinar sign we see in the variant form of CJD. Okay, so pulvinar or hockey stick sign is a sign of CJD. So this is all about the different dementias that we got to be aware of. Now let's take an approach to headache. So headache summarized in one slide for you. So here we want to see whether the headache is unilateral or bilateral. If the headache is unilateral, look at the buzzwords. So here this is all about pattern based approach. Alright, that's how you have to do neurology. So when the headache is unilateral and you see that it is pulsatile, it is for almost a day, 4 to 72 hours, there is nausea with the presence, aura may or may not be there. So pulsatile headache with nausea for almost a day, hallmark being unilateral. This is your starting point always. We are dealing with migraine. Yeah, so this is migraine typical history. The first line drug in migraines are gonna be NSAIDs, but the drug of choice are your 5-HT1B1D agonists, which cause vasoconstriction. This is triptans. Alright, so triptans are the drug of choice. Whereas for prophylaxis, very well known, it is propranolol or beta blocker, which is the drug of choice. Now, for new drugs in migraine, you want to remember we have 5-HT1F agonist, which are your DTANs, alright. So, we have lasmiditan, other DTANs, so you just want to remember DTANs. You also have monoclonal antibodies, which are going to block the calcitonin gene related peptide, which is considered to be the center point of why migraine occurs. So, the trick here is the moment you see NU in the name, right? No matter what the name is, if you see NE or NU, which is for neuron, that is for migraine, alright? So, any new that you see, erinimumab, galinizumab, it's all for migraine, okay? So, this is about pharmacotherapy in a nutshell. Now, extremely important, if you have repetitive headaches, they come in clusters and you have something around the eye, unilateral eye, it's periorbital, you have lacrimation, you have Horner syndrome which is associated. So, if this is seen in a male, almost all of the other headaches are more common in females except this one. So, this is your clue. So, if you get these clusters of headaches which last for 15 minutes to 3 hours, this is cluster headache. If the headache is much shorter, now this is slightly extra edge predominantly for INI-CT. If the headache is shorter, 2 to 30 minutes and it responds to indomethacin, this is paroxysmal hemicrania, specific entity paroxysmal hemicrania. If it is very short lasting, 5 to 200 seconds, for a few minutes you have this burning stabbing pain, this is what is known as SUNCT. What is SUNCT? It is short lasting unilateral neuralgiform headache attacks with conjunctival injection and tearing. Just reading this makes me want to tear. So you want to remember that there's something known as SUNCT which has very short acting pain unilateral around the eye. The biggest differential is when it's not around the eye but around the jaw. So this is trigeminal neuralgia. Very, very important. The territory is what is going to help you distinguish these two. Coming to the treatment for clusters, the drug of choice is 100% oxygen plus triptans. Whereas for prophylaxis, the drug of choice becomes verapamil. Multiple times asked repeat question. As far as trigeminal neuralgia is concerned, the drug of choice is carbamazepine. In refractory cases, we can do gamma knife as well. Okay, so this is all about unilateral headache. Very, very important. Bilateral, something which is the most common, you and I have it, band-like headache. 4 to 6 hours this can last. This is tension headache, right? So this is tension headache. The drug of choice is nothing but NSAIDs. But if you do have it for a long time, more than 15 days a month, it's an indication of TCA. TCAs are the drug of choice for prophylaxis. Apart from that, if you have bilateral dull aching headache and then you have signs like raised intracranial pressure such as papilledema on ophthalmic examination, you have diplopia because of 6th cranial nerve palsy, and look at the MRI. You can see how the optic nerve sheath is distended. This is the hallmark of pseudotumor cerebri or idiopathic intracranial hypertension. Okay, so here the history, the risk factors are very important. Remember toad, yeah, frog, toad. So tetracycline, obesity, vitamin A, danazol. So these are your risk factors for idiopathic intracranial hypertension. Here the management, remember, would be to avoid the risk factors. That would be the primary management, weight loss followed by acetazolamide. And in refractory cases, you can do repeated lumbar punctures or an optic fenestration procedure. So these are the different treatment options for IIH. So this is all about headache in one slide that you want to revise. So now let's discuss demyelinating disorders. What you have to remember here is that demyelinating disorders can be divided into two. You can have central demyelination wherein the target is going to be the oligodendrocytes, or it could be peripheral demyelination where the target is the Schwann cell. Alright, so that's the first concept. Now there are three main central demyelinating disorders that we want to first learn the approach to. So here we are going to be talking about the pattern approach. There are mainly two things that you have to see. One, all of these are going to have brain lesions. That's not going to help us distinguish as far as the pattern is concerned. So two main features that you look at is the spinal cord involvement and the optic nerve. So that is what I'm going to highlight here, that how the optic optic nerve involvement and spinal cord involvement in all of these three disorders is going to help you reach the ultimate diagnosis. So first we learn about the prototype central demyelinating disorder, which is multiple sclerosis. So very, very important, MS, multiple sclerosis, is the main demyelinating disorder, the most common one. The demographic is going to be females, young females 20 to 40 years of age. So this is more common in females as compared to males. It has different patterns, but the most common pattern that we have is the RRMS. RRMS meaning relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. As the name suggests, is going to have multiple episodes which will remit, which will be okay, and then they will happen again. And for that, there is one criteria. So the criteria for MS is known as McDonald's criteria. What is McDonald's criteria? Is basically the dissemination in time and space. So what it tells us, what is the meaning of this dissemination in time and space? So basically what it says is that the lesions should be varied in time, meaning there should be lesions which have happened at different time periods, right? So that is what it describes, the relapsing remitting part. And space meaning different areas of the brain have to be involved. So you can have juxtacortical involvement, you can have brainstem involvement, you can have spinal cord involvement, optic nerve involvement. So different parts of the brain should be involved. So you can't have the same area. So you need to have both of these criteria being fulfilled. Apart from that, one-liner is the Charcot's triad, which is seen in MS. So this is SIN. A similar mnemonic I had taught you for AKI as well. You have sepsis, you have ischemia and nephrotoxins, which are the three causes of renal causes of AKI, right? Here in MS, SIN is going to stand for one, scanning speech. Second is an intention tremor. And third is nystagmus. So this is the triad, which is the Charcot's triad of MS. You have two particular signs which could be buzzwords, in clinical questions. One is the Lermit sign, when the patient is going to describe a shock-like sensation down the cervical spine. That's the Lermit sign. The second is the Uthoff sign, or the phenomenon wherein the symptoms are going to worsen when a patient takes a hot bath. So very peculiar kind of a syndrome. What happens is when the temperature rises, when you take a hot bath, the conduction block, which is the feature of these demyelinating disorder, tends to worsen, and that is why the symptoms worsen with a hot bath. That's the Uthoff's sign. Now coming to the pattern. So optic nerves typically is going to be asymmetrically involved. So it's going to be unilateral asymmetrical involvement, which is what is typical. And spinal cord, extremely important, is short segment. So you're going to have short segment spinal cord involvement, meaning that when we look at it longitudinally, it is not going to span more than 3 vertebral segments. And when I look at it in a cross-sectional manner, again it is patchy and partial. So patchy, partial, short segment spinal cord involvement is what is typical. When we look at the brain lesions, remember the investigation of choice is a contrast enhanced MRI. Why? Because on the basis of the contrast enhancement, I can distinguish between active and inactive lesions. The active lesions can show enhancement, the inactive lesions will not show enhancement. So this can actually tell me about the dissemination in time, that this is an older lesion. So it actually helps us fulfill the criteria, right? And the typical involvement, which I'm sure all of you all know, is this periventricular involvement. So there's a sagittal image you can see around the lateral ventricle. You're having in the corpus callosum, there are these white lesions, okay? So this is what we look at very nicely on a FLAIR image. So FLAIR MRI, we have talked about it in radiology, that shows us these periventricular ependymal lesions. So these are known as Dawson fingers. So these are typically referred to as Dawson fingers. So the subependymal periventricular involvement is what is seen on the MRI, which is the hallmark of MS. Now talking about the differentials. So the prototype MS is done. 2 differentials you have to consider. This is something that you see in an younger child, a younger patient less than 20 years, and it is not relapsing remitting. It's a monophasic event, a one-time event, and usually you will get a clinical scenario. They'll describe a child who has had maybe a URTI or a GI infection, and following that is having disseminated demyelinating lesions, multiple neurological manifestations. The optic nerve involvement, the optic neuritis is going to be bilateral, and spinal cord is going to be long segment. So opposite of MS. And the disease we're talking about is ADEM. What is ADEM? Acute disseminated encephalomyelitis. So as the name suggests, disseminated encephalo, brain getting involved, myelitis, spinal cord getting involved. And you can see how in the brain MRI, in the FLAIR sequence, now there are multifocal lesions, right? These are described as popcorn, soap bubble lesions. So multiple confluent lesions are going to be seen instead of the periventricular patches we were seeing in MS. So this is about ADEM. One consideration, very important, repeat INI-CT question. Now we're talking about NMO, neuromyelitis optica. Again, the name itself tells you there's going to be optic nerve, spinal cord and brain involvement, and this is also referred to as the Devick's disease. A young patient here with bilateral optic nerve, long segment spinal cord. So much like ADEM, except that the age is higher. And the antibodies, what is the hallmark here? You are going to be seeing anti-aquaporin 4 antibody, right? So aquaporin 4 antibody is the hallmark. Apart from that, what is the feature here? Because these aquaporin 4 receptors are along the ependyma, are along the ventricular system, the manifestation here is going to be again periventricular. So you can have the lateral ventricle getting affected, you can have the diencephalon getting affected, you can have the area proxima, which is around the fourth ventricle, getting affected. And that's why the clinical features include the area proxima syndrome and the diencephalon syndrome. This is a part of the diagnostic criteria, and this was asked as a repeat question. Obviously, myelitis and optic nerve we get from the name itself, right? So this is about the 3 demyelinating disorders of the brain that we have to know about. Now let's talk about peripheral demyelinating disorder, which presents at acute flaccid paralysis. So suddenly you have flaccid paralysis, which is of the type of lower motor neuron. So what would be the DDs? So if typically you get this history of 1 to 3 weeks prior GI and respiratory infection, always want to look at the MRI. If they're giving you these buzzwords that there's truncal paralysis, there is a level beyond which you have loss of sensations, you have bowel bladder involvement, and this is how you are going to identify TM, transverse myelitis. Very, very important. Sensory level is a must. Bowel bladder is a must. You are going to see this long segment spinal cord hyperintensity like this MRI. On the other hand, very, very important, the prototype is Guillain-Barré syndrome. So here you're going to have prior history of some sort of GI or sexually transmitted infection. The one bacteria which is implicated is Campylobacter. Yeah, so you want to remember there is acute ascending bilateral flaccid paralysis, DTRs are absent, you can have autonomic manifestations as well. So what happens when you have Schwann cells which are not working? That saltatory conduction doesn't happen at nodes of Ranvier, which is very quick. So you're going to have a conduction block which results in velocity getting reduced and distal latencies. So they frequently ask you the nerve conduction velocity study results here, okay? So remember, demyelination, because of the speed getting reduced, you're going to have distal latencies and the velocities are reduced. A few variants you want to remember. So AIDP is nothing but Guillain-Barré, which is acute inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy. The antibody is anti-GM1. The prototype is demyelination. There are few variants, Aman and Amsen. So you want to remember Aman. If you've seen Shark Tank, you know there's Aman there. And Aman is very ziddi. From ziddi, you remember GD. Alright, so Aman is GD and it's an axonal type. Amsen is also axonal. So this is just motor, whereas this is motor sensory. One syndrome very frequently tested is Miller fissure. So it's a triad of ophthalmoplegia, ataxia, areflexia, and anti-GQ1B seen in 90%. So this is very, very important. We have to remember these antibodies and you will get the answer. So this is axonal as well as demyelinating. Extremely important everywhere, including MS, transverse myelitis. We are going to be using steroids, but steroids have no role in GBS, and that is what is the question always. So remember, no role of steroids in GBS. The first line is IVIG and plasmapheresis, and it has a very good prognosis. Okay, so this is what you want to remember, and you want to keep monitoring the spirometry of the patient so that the diaphragm is not affected. Once it involves the diaphragm, you're going to have respiratory arrest because it is ascending. So you keep monitoring the patient's FVC on spirometry to see if intubation is needed or not. So that's very important for GBS. Okay. Now let's talk about approach to tremor and rigidity. So here, when I give you the typical history of postural instability, so this is your typical trap: tremor, rigidity, akinesia, and postural instability. So this is prototype Parkinson's disease. If you have to write, they're going to have very small handwriting, mask-like phases. We've already talked about shuffling gait. In the late stages, you can have dementia and depression. Contrast this with early onset dementia with Parkinson's symptoms and visual hallucination. We have already talked about it. Lewy body. So remember, in Parkinson's, the dementia is going to be delayed, whereas in Lewy body, it's early dementia with visual hallucinations. Okay, so that's what. On the other hand, you have certain Parkinson plus syndromes. Parkinson's has a good response to dopamine, whereas all of the Parkinson plus syndromes, remember, have a poor response to dopamine. On the MRI, if you see this kind of a feature, which is the tapering of the anterior midbrain, you are seeing that there is atrophy of the anterior midbrain. This is known as the hummingbird sign. The midbrain looks like the hummingbird. This is progressive supranuclear palsy. The hallmark here is downward gaze is impaired and the patient has a lot of falls. Alright, so there's ataxia and gaze. The moment you hear the word gaze, we're talking about progressive supranuclear palsy. When you see that autonomic manifestations are a lot, and you see that there is this demyelination like a cross. What is this? This is the hot cross bun sign, and the diagnosis is going to be multi-system atrophy. There are two MSA, MSA-C and MSA-P. Remember, just because it is involving the pons, this is not P, this is MSA-C. So you see this hot cross bun sign in pons in the C variant. Okay. And just one buzzword for you, alien limb phenomenon is being mentioned with tremor and rigidity. It is CBD, corticobasal degeneration. That's your takeaway from this Parkinson plus disorder. Alright, again slightly extra edge, more for INICT. In other exams, you mostly expect questions from Parkinson's only. Alright, now let's go to infections. Here I want to talk about lumbar puncture. So lumbar puncture, remember, let's start off with this anatomy question. What are all the layers that are punctured? So first two layers everybody is going to tell me it is skin and subcutaneous fat. What next? Then the order starts going wrong, isn't it? So the first ligament that you have to puncture is the supraspinous ligament. After the supraspinous ligament, you have the interspinous ligament. After the interspinous ligament, you're going to have the ligamentum flavum, then you're going to puncture the dura, and then you're going to puncture the arachnoid. So this is the sequence of events for reaching the subarachnoid space. Okay, so this is very, very important. Now, what are all the indications where you would directly not do a LP for the patient? Whenever you're suspecting infection, you want to do LP. It's the investigation of choice for CNS infections. But what are the indications where you want to do a CCT first? So here you want to remember a mnemonic: fails P. So fails P are all of the conditions where you do a CCT first. So F is anytime you have focal neurological deficit. It is likely that the person has maybe an abscess. If the person is coming to you with fever, you want to first rule out an abscess by doing a CCT rather than a lumbar puncture. If you see altered mental status, the GCS is impaired, not something you would find in meningitis alone. Likely there is encephalitis. Again, you want to do imaging before doing LP. If you have immunocompromised patient, the patient can have some space occupying lesion. If you do an LP in somebody who has raised intracranial pressure, there's going to be tonsillar herniation, there's going to be coning, right? So you want to always rule that out first. So very important, history of HIV AIDS if it's mentioned, always do a CCT first. L is if there is a known lesion, already patient is a known case of a brain tumor, you wanna do an imaging first. S is seizure, if there is history of seizure, again very unlikely to be meningitis, do a CCT first. And most important, papilledema, always do an ophthalmoscopy before doing LP to rule out papilledema. So this is very important, this is how they can give you a trapper of a clinical question. So always rule these out first and then mark lumbar puncture. Okay, so now we've done all of this, we've ruled it out, we've punctured the layers, we have the sample, we have the result. Now let's interpret that. So normally it's gonna be clear fluid, 0 to 5 cells, 40 to 70 is the normal glucose, protein is low, and this is the normal opening pressure. In bacterial meningitis, it's gonna be turbid. The cells are gonna be markedly raised with a neutrophilic predominance. Glucose is gonna be very low, protein is gonna be very high, opening pressure is going to be very high. So everything is in extremes, neutrophilia is your hack here. Whereas in tuberculosis, again it will be turbid, one buzzword would be cobweb coagulum. This is also a repeat image based question. If you see that, think tuberculosis. Again the cells are going to be markedly raised, but you have a lymphocytic predominance now. Glucose markedly low, protein markedly high, opening pressure high. So everything like bacterial except the type of cells. Whereas in viral and fungal, now the trick is that the glucose could be normal, alright, it's not gonna be so severe. It could be clear here in viral and fungal. The cells are mildly raised and they are predominantly lymphocytic. The protein is also mildly increased. Opening pressure remains normal more or less in viral, whereas it is increased in cryptococcal. One hallmark is cryptococcal meningitis has typically raised opening pressure, okay? Whereas in Guillain-Barré, extremely important, gonna mark it in red, you have albuminocytological dissociation. Albuminocytological dissociation means albumin is high, so the protein is gonna be high, whereas the cells here are normal. Okay, so you want to remember albuminocytological dissociation, whereas in MS you see oligoclonal bands. Both of these are very, very important findings. I didn't tell you these earlier because you want to compile all of this in CSF. Okay, so this is about all of the CSF findings. Going ahead to the Brodmann areas, you did not remember everything, just remember the important ones. We've already done somatosensory is 312, primary motor is 4, and motor association is 6. Then you want to remember frontal eye field. So for this, draw a set of specs. Yeah, so when you invert the specs, it becomes an 8. Yeah, so this is frontal eye field. Very, very important. There are two things that you want to remember. If you have a lesion in frontal eye field, you look towards the side of lesion. So basically, if you have a right brain lesion, you look towards the right side in frontal eye field, which basically translates to say that right-sided brain lesion will have left hemiplegia, but the eyes are gonna go opposite. So if the eyes go opposite from hemiplegia or they go towards side of lesion, you localize to frontal eye field. Opposite is gonna be in PPRF. PPRF is your pontine reticular formation that you have. So this is gonna be opposite. Here you look away from the side of lesion. Alright, so either you remember in terms of side of lesion or hemiplegia. Just remember one thing. So towards side of lesion is frontal eye field, PPRF is away. So this is area number 8. Then what you want to remember, visual cortex. I've already told you, you start seeing people at 17. Then what you want to remember is auditory and gustatory. So at around 41-42, let's say you are 41 years old and somebody tells you that there's a very good restaurant somewhere in town. So you hear about a restaurant at 41 years. 2 years it takes you to finally go there and eat. So finally at 43, you go and eat and stimulate gustatory cortex. Okay, so that's how we remember gustatory 43, auditory 41-42. Coming to very important visual association cortex area, which is 39. So 39 corresponds to the angular gyrus, and if you have a lesion of the angular gyrus, remember the syndrome that is going to occur is the Gerstmann syndrome. In Gerstmann syndrome, what all do you have? So you have agraphia, acalculia, Finger agnosia, if you ask this person what finger is this, they can't say. And right left spatial disorientation. All right, the teacher teaching you also has right left spatial disorientation. All right, so I keep struggling with right left, especially after radiology, everything is gone. All right, so you want to remember agraphia, acalculia, finger agnosia, right left spatial disorientation are all features of just man, which is localized to angular, that to dominant angular gyrus. All right, so dominant lobe angular gyrus is just man. Now coming to the, which is Broca's and Wernicke's. So now let's discuss aphasia. So Broca's area is area number 44. So this is what regulates the fluency of speech. Yeah, so this is in first say frontal lobe, first say fluency, and first say 44. This is how you remember Broca's area 44. On the other hand, Wernicke's area is the comprehension area, right? So this is comprehension area and this is located in the temporal bone. So this here, remember, is the inferior frontal gyrus, whereas this is the superior temporal gyrus. All right, so IFG and STG. And from T for temporal, you remember T for 22. Okay, so far so good. 44 is frontal and temporal is 22. Brodmann area is sorted. Now let's do the vascular supply. So vascular supply, remember, is opposite. The world is again upside down. So inferior frontal gyrus is supplied by the superior division of MCA, whereas the superior temporal gyrus is supplied by the inferior division of MCA. Okay, so the name is opposite to the supply is what you remember. Fine, so this takes care of the most important Brodmann areas that you gotta do. Now let's go about the approach to aphasias. So here first let's recognize what aphasia is what. So let's say you wanna say I want an apple and you go apple, meaning you can't see, the speech is broken. So broken means Broca's aphasia. On the other hand, you want to say I want an apple, but you just say some gibberish. So what is this? This is Wernicke's, meaning the comprehension is gone. All right, so this is Wernicke's. You are speaking a lot. It's not broken. It's just not making sense. On the other hand, you just can't repeat, just the repetition is gone. This is known as conduction aphasia. So you have the Broca's area, Wernicke's area connected by the arcuate fasciculus. So remember, any of these is impaired, repetition is gone. If repetition is gone plus broken speech, it is Broca's aphasia. If only repetition is gone, arcuate fascicle is gone. And if you have Wernicke's aphasia, repetition is gone, comprehension is gone. All right, I hope this is clear. So let's try and fill this curve. You can only fill this graph if your concepts are clear here. So let's have a look. Poor repetition. So anything above this in 3 quadrants, can I say it is one of these 3 things? Because in all 3 the repetition is lost. Yeah. So when there is good comprehension but non-fluent speech, can I say it is Broca's aphasia? Correct. If I see that there is poor comprehension but fluent speech, this is Wernicke's aphasia. And when I see both of them are good but the repetition is gone, this is conduction aphasia. Alright, so this is sorted. The moment repetition is good, it means that there is transcortical involvement. It's not the conduction fasciculus which is gone. So when you have non-fluent speech with good comprehension and good repetition, this is your transcortical motor aphasia. When you have poor comprehension with fluent speech, this is transcortical sensory aphasia. And when you have everything gone, you have non-fluent speech, you have poor comprehension, but repetition is the only thing that is left. You have isolated the repetition. This is isolation aphasia. Alright, so this is how you're going to approach the different types of aphasias. Now, let's go to stroke. Now, quickly, let's go to the approach to stroke. So, anytime you have a patient with irreversible focal neurological deficit, that is assumed to be stroke unless proven otherwise. You must know the FAST, which is for the layman to recognize stroke early, because remember, time is brain. So, what is FAST? When any one side of the face is drooping, look at the face, look at the arms if there is any arm weakness, look at the speech if there is any slurring of speech, and time to call for ambulance. So all of these are things that you want to remember. This is the fast approach. One more sign that can indicate a stroke is the presence of a pronator drift. So the person cannot raise the hands like this steadily. Okay, so this is what you want to be aware of as far as the screening goes. Now, what is the first thing you are going to do? Very quickly you want to do an NCCT. This is to determine whether it's a hemorrhagic stroke or a ischemic stroke. If you see white hemorrhage, if you see hyperdensity like this CT, it is hemorrhagic stroke. You take that patient out of the stroke protocol. This would be managed separately. Alright, so this image here, very important, is showing you a basal ganglia bleed. You can see how the putamen of the lentiform nucleus, which is the most common site of bleed in hypertensives, is what is seen here. So this is putaminal bleed, hypertensive bleed in elderly. So this is hemorrhagic stroke. The main aim to do the NCCT is to rule out hemorrhage. You may or may not see ischemic stroke on a CT. Remember that we are not looking for that. We just want to rule out hemorrhage. The moment you have ruled out hemorrhage and you have ruled out contraindications to thrombolytics, very important. What are the contraindications to thrombolytics? Repeat question. BP, despite treating, is more than 185/110. There are bleeding diathesis, recent head injury or IC hemorrhage. There has been a history of surgery in the last 2 weeks, GI bleed in 3 weeks, or recent MI. You need to memorize this. Any of this is not present, we cannot give thrombolytics to the patient. And we look at window period. Window period means when was the patient last seen well. For example, let's say that the patient was sleeping. When he woke up, he has weakness of the right arm, and now he comes to the hospital 2 hours later. Is he in the window period? No. Even the patient will tell you, I'm having symptoms since 2 hours. Yeah. But when was he last seen well? That was in the night before he slept. So that is what you're going to be taking for your window period. Very important. When was he last seen well? Especially in sleeping patients or patients who have a stroke in the morning. Alright. So this is about the window period. If the time from the onset of symptoms is less than 4.5 hours, no contraindications through thrombolytics, you can give thrombolytics. On the other hand, if the patient has no contraindications but time has elapsed, it's less than 6 hours but more than 4.5 hours, you do a CT angiography with a CT perfusion. The aim is angiography shows you the thrombus, whether there is a main artery which is involved or not. P for perfusion, P for penumbra. Perfusion shows you the penumbra. Both of these are present. You can go for interventional radiology, intra-arterial thrombolysis, or you can do a mechanical thrombectomy. If there is no penumbra, penumbra means is there any salvageable area which is not yet infarcted. This is what we find from the CT perfusion. Alright, so if there is no penumbra, and the thrombus is not involving the main artery, the intra-arterial therapy will not help. Alright, so very important. If you have a main artery thrombus with a penumbra, you want to do intra-arterial treatment. Alright, so this is the approach to stroke that you want to remember. Now let's talk about localization. Alright, so this is stroke localization. Just look at the buzzwords and your answer becomes very easy. So when you have lower limb affected with paralysis, sensory loss, urinary incontinence is because of the paracentral lobule getting involved. This is ACA territory. Every vessel in the brain has a specific territory which it supplies, right? So this is an ACA territory infarct because of the frontal lobe getting affected. If you have face and upper limb, it is likely to be an MCA stroke. Now which side? So when you have Broca's aphasia, what does this mean? Broca's aphasia means it's the dominant hemisphere, and you also want to remember because it is Broca's, it is what? Inferior frontal gyrus. So this becomes the superior division of MCA. So here you have dominant sided superior division of MCA which is affected. If you have Wernicke's aphasia, which division of MCA? It is again the dominant side but now inferior division of MCA. Remember, superior temporal gyrus, inferior division of MCA, right? On the other hand, we've also studied in ophthalm how in the temporal lobe you have STEMI. Do you remember this from opthal? You have pi in the sky. You're gonna have superior quadrant anopia. Yeah, so two pies, two quadrants getting lost on the superior aspect. Okay, so this is about dominant inferior division of MCA. If you find in addition to face and upper limb you are having this hemispatial neglect, very important, both of these are repeat questions. Look at this man and look at this clock face which has been drawn here. So what you find is that for these people half of the world does not exist. This is when you have a lesion in the non-dominant parietal lobe. So when you have a lesion in the non-dominant parietal lobe, that is on the right sided parietal lobe, when you have a lesion, for these patients there is going to be contralateral hemispatial neglect. The left side does not exist. Look at his face. He wanted to shave his face, but he doesn't know left side of the face exists. He has not shaved it. I asked him to draw an entire clock. I already made this circle. I asked him to draw an entire clock. For this, left sided world does not exist, so they've only drawn it here. Alright, so this is hemispatial neglect. On the other hand, when there is hemianopia or denial of blindness is known as Anton syndrome. Cortical blindness is what this is known as. You can also have alexia without agraphia. This is where you localize it to the dominant splenium of corpus callosum. This is PCA territory stroke. Finally, when you have contralateral hemisensory loss with this agonizing burning pain, this is known as the Dejerine-Roussy syndrome, and this is when you localize it to the thalamus. Alright, so this is thalamic stroke. So this is all about stroke localization. A lot of application of brain lobe functions go into it, but once you get a hang of it, it's pretty easy. Now let's talk about a few names that could be asked as image based questions. So this is what is stereognosis. If I ask you to close your eyes and give you this pen and you identify that this is an Apple pencil, this is stereognosis. On the other hand, you close your eyes and I write something and you identify a game we used to play, this is graphesthesia. So this is graphesthesia. What is this? If I ask the patient to circle all the A's in this image, the person will circle all the small A's, but the larger A's the person will miss. This is what is known as simultagnosia. This is also called as missing the forest for the trees. The person is so focused on looking at individual trees that he forgets that there's a forest around him. So that is known as simultagnosia. Alright, so this is very important. These are all because of the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe controls all of these functions, whereas the ability to recognize known phases, like if you can't say this is Mahatma Gandhi, you probably have what is known as prosopagnosia, the inability to recognize known phases, right? And this is what you can localize to the occipital lobe. Alright, so these could be asked. Now let's go to brainstem stroke. So here I'm going to teach you two things. One, I'm going to teach you how to localize if you have a clinical question. Second, we are just going to name the different syndromes which have been asked. Alright, so those are two independent things. Now, how we localize based on the clinical history, the most important tool here is cranial nerves. Cranial nerves tell us where it is. Is it a midbrain stroke? Is it a pons stroke? Or it is medullary stroke? So that's the first step. So if it is a midbrain stroke, third and fourth cranial nerves. If it is a pontine stroke, 5, 6, 7, 8 get involved, and if 9 to 12 cranial nerves are involved, it is medullary stroke. Yeah, so this tells us the localization. Now medial versus lateral. Anything which is a multiple of 12 is medial. So both 3 and 4 cranial nerves are medial, whereas 6 is medial and 5, 7, 8 are lateral. 12 is medial, whereas 9, 10, 11 are lateral. So when you see these nerves getting affected, you know it is a medial midbrain, medial pons, or medial medullary stroke. Yeah, so this is very useful. Apart from that, from medial you remember all M's. What are all the structures which are going to be involved in the medial brainstem stroke? So first is medial longitudinal fasciculus. If this is involved, you're going to have what is known as internuclear ophthalmoplegia. Something very important with MS, multiple sclerosis as well, tends to affect this white matter tract. Apart from that,
Motor symptoms, so you're gonna have weakness, contralateral weakness because of corticospinal tracts getting involved, and you will have medial lemniscus getting involved, so you're gonna have loss of proprioception, loss of joint position, yeah, all of these are gonna be given. So motor, medial lemniscus, MLF. On the other hand, laterally, all S's. You're gonna have spinocerebellar tracts getting involved. So you're gonna have ataxia. You're gonna have sympathetic plexus getting involved. So you can have Horner's syndrome, and you're gonna have spinothalamic tract getting involved. So you're gonna have pain, temperature getting lost. All right, so this is how you're going to localize to medial versus lateral. I hope this is easy. Just see the cranial nerves and half of the job is anyways done. Now we have certain named syndromes that we want to identify. So the moment I see that down and out pupil, it's third cranial nerve, so I know it's midbrain. So this is a midbrain syndrome. In fact, the first 4 syndromes are midbrain syndromes, which we want to know. When there is hemiplegia with down and out pupil, this is known as Weber syndrome. When you see there is hyperkinesis, chorea tremor, this is because of red nucleus getting involved. From red, you want to remember a lot of British actors have red hair, right? So from red hair, you want to remember Benedict. You know Benedict Cumberbatch, he has red hair. He doesn't, but you remember he has red hair. So this is Benedict syndrome. If you have hemiataxia, which is because of the superior cerebellar peduncle, as well as red nucleus, as well as third cranial nerve, everything, a combination of everything, C for combination, this is Cloth syndrome. So these are 3 midbrain syndromes, and then you have a dorsal midbrain syndrome where you have an upward gaze palsy. Remember, in progressive supranuclear palsy, you have downward gaze palsy. Here you have upward gaze palsy, and you have something known as Collier sign. This is what is known as Parinod syndrome. This is dorsal midbrain because it's the tectum which is regulating your upward gaze. Very, very important, alright. So this is Parinod syndrome. This is frequently affected in pineal tumors like pineal germinomas. Okay, so this is very important. Now going on to the pons. So how do I know it is pons? Look at the nerves. 6, 6, 7, 8, 6. So 3 pontine syndromes. So first, when you have 6 and 7, this is Millard-Gubler. How to remember? Gubler has 6 letters, Millard has 7. So 6 plus 7. When all are involved, so many structures, MLF, 6, 7, 8, hemisensory loss. So what is this? All. So this is Four-Wall or Four-Will syndrome is how you remember. And when it's only 6, you see how 6 is very common, isn't it? So a very common brand is Raymond. So you want to remember this is Raymond syndrome. So these are 3 pontine syndromes. Now we have tongue getting involved. So tongue means 12th cranial nerve. So we are in the medulla. Can you tell me medial or lateral? So the moment I see 12 and I see motor, it is medial medullary syndrome, which is also known as Dejerine syndrome. Remember, Dejerine-Rousey is thalamus, just Dejerine is medial medullary. If you have loss of pain, temperature, medial or lateral, already I know it is spinothalamic, so lateral. There is Horner's, there is dysphagia, hoarseness, loss of gag because of 10th cranial nerve. So this is lateral medullary syndrome, very, very important. Wallenberg syndrome is what is this, alright. So they can give you clinical history, and after this you should not get a brainstem syndrome wrong, alright. So this is about this. Finally, we want to talk about epilepsy syndromes and anti-epileptic drugs. So now we have certain epilepsy syndromes. So this is again PEDS neurointegration that we want to do. So they can give you these EEG. These are the most important EEGs that you should know about. So when they tell you that there is an infant with global developmental delay and the patient has these salam spells. So this is what is known as salam spells, in which you are going to be seeing this sudden flexion of the neck and torso, and the legs are going to be extended. So this is what is known as infantile seizures or salam spells. And look at this chaotic EEG. This chaotic EEG is what is known as Hips arrhythmia. Alright, so what is the diagnosis in this case? This is West syndrome. So remember, infantile spasms, Hips arrhythmia. Also there is something known as electrodetrimental response on EEG. These are all buzzwords for West syndrome. On the other hand, very, very important, there is transient loss of consciousness for 1 or 2 seconds without any loss of postural control. So you will feel like the person is just staring. This is frequently reported by teachers that the child is not paying attention. The child is just staring into open space. Yeah, but he's actually having an absent seizure. There's also something that is provoked by hyperventilation or photic stimulation. Typical EEG is this 3 hertz. The moment you hear 3, remember 1 to 3, 1 to 2 seconds loss of consciousness, 3 hertz spike in wave. This is absence seizure. Yeah, so what I described for you is the typical absence seizure. On the other hand, extremely important for exams. If you don't know, you can mark this. If they tell you an adolescent patient comes to you with dropping things early in the morning, you know, the patient is dropping stuff. The parents say that the child is very clumsy in the morning, and there's this 3 to 6 hertz generalized polyspike and wave discharge. This is juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. Very, very important. All right, this is thought to be a problem with the REM sleep. All right, so this is juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. And if you have multifocal types of seizures, you have generalized, you have focal seizures, different types with this slow spike and wave pattern. This is Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. This is one of the refractory syndrome types that we have. This is LGS. Alright, so these are 4 syndromes you should be aware of. JME and absence particularly important. With this, we go on to the pharmacology. In CNS pharma, anti-epileptic is the most important. So here there is a very busy slide in front of you. There are lots of mechanisms by which you have anti-epileptics which are acting. So what we can do is either I can increase the GABA or I can reduce the stimulation by blocking sodium calcium channels. Yeah, so either we increase GABA activity or we reduce sodium calcium activity. The main drugs which increase the GABA could be GABA agonist. So I'm sure you know benzodiazepines and barbiturates. So from today onwards, you remember barbiturates. So barbiturates are gonna increase the duration of the opening of the chloride channel. So they increase duration, whereas benzodiazepines increase the frequency. So BZDs increase the frequency, whereas barbiturates increase the duration. So these are GABA agonists. Alright, topiramate also has this action of GABA agonist in addition. Alright, so topiramate has 2 actions, one of which is also sodium channel blocker. Okay, so that's a dual action there. So here we have GABA agonists. 2 agonists that you want to remember, particularly phenobarb is what is used in neonatal seizures. In benzodiazepines, we have 3 very important drugs. We have lorazepam that you're going to use in status epilepticus. We have diazepam that you're going to use as first line for febrile seizures. And we have clobazam, which is now being approved for LGS as well, Lennox-Gastaut. So remember these 3, we are going to note them down in the next slide. Okay, so this is GABA agonist. We can also increase the release of GABA. So this is by pregabalin or gabapentin, and these are frequently used for neuropathic pain and not anti-epileptic drugs per se. Okay, then you can have reuptake inhibitor, so that is tiagabin, or you can have transaminase inhibitor, that is vigabatrin. Do not focus on valproate because it has all 3 actions, so you don't want to remember. So you want to remember vigabatrin. The name itself tells you GABA transaminase inhibitor, and from V, the only letter which was left, it also tells us that there is a visual field defect here. So this causes visual field defects. The vigabatrin is the best drug ever for us medicos to remember because V is visual field defect, GABA transaminase inhibition. Alright, so this is about these drugs which are acting on GABA. Now let's go to some newer drugs. So we have AMPA receptor blocker, which is perampanel, and we have NMDA blocker, which is felbamate. Effectively, both are reducing the depolarization. Just remember the names. We also have a potassium channel opener, which is retigabin or izogabin, known as your gabin. So remember, even though they have GABA in their name, they have nothing to do with GABA. That's the only trapper. They'll give you this as option of some GABA, but this is not acting by GABA receptor. And the newest best drug in the market nowadays is levetiracetam, which is a SV2A receptor blocker. Very, very important. Synapse vesicle is what it does. It blocks the exocytosis of sodium and calcium vesicles. Okay, so so that is levetiracetam. Now coming to calcium. So calcium channel blockers, ethosuximide blocks the T type channels, and that is why this is the drug for T for typical absence seizure. Gabapentin also has this action, so that's one thing you can remember. Most important is ethosuximide. Ethosuximide side effect is EFGHIJ, so very non-specific: fatigue, GI, headache, itching. The most important is Stephen-Johnson syndrome here. Okay, so that's ethosuximide. Now let's go to sodium channel blockers. So sodium channel blockers, we have carbamazepine and oxcarbamazepine. Last INICET question, remember carbamazepine has higher risk of SJS, whereas oxcarbamazepine has a higher risk of SIADH. Alright, so this is what you want to remember, SIADH more in ox. Okay, so you can remember SOX. Okay, apart from that, carbamazepine can have diplopia, ataxia, agranulocytosis is the most important side effect. It is also hepatotoxic. All anti-epileptic drugs, remember, except lamotrigine and levetiracetam are contraindicated in pregnancy. So this is also gonna cause neural tube defects, and it is an inducer as well. Okay, so the question here is SGH versus SIADH, which drug has more? Topiramate also causes glaucoma. This is a very important repeat question. Topiramate also causes renal stones. Alright, so two very important side effects of topiramate are important. Coming to phenytoin, phenytoin is also a sodium channel blocker, so I'm sure you know, you can remember it with the name itself, phenytoin. So it is a P450 inducer. It is causing lymph nodal enlargement known as pseudolymphoma, H for hirsutism, E for enlarged gums, N for nystagmus, yellow-brown skin, T for teratogenicity, wherein the main is neural tube defects, osteopenia from O, I for inhibited folate absorption, that you can remember with neural tube itself, neuropathy. So this is how phenytoin can help you remember phenytoin side effects. Not very important. Coming to valproate, why I put this in the side? Because it has all mechanisms. It can block sodium, calcium and GABA agonist as well. So again, the name helps you with the mnemonic. The most important is liver damage and pancreatitis. Pancreatitis is very important. I am sure you remember. This is the most teratogenic drug. It also causes neural tube defects, very high risk of neural tube defects. It can also cause weight gain, extremely important. Okay, so this is about the anti-epileptic drugs, about the inducer and inhibitors. Just forget it right now. I will compile all of this in general pharma, and that's where we will be learning it. Okay, lastly, let's talk about lamotrigine. It is one of the drugs that is safe in pregnancy, but now it's not being encouraged a lot because of very high risk of SJH and hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis. This is again a black box warning, meaning this has been discovered in the phase 4 of clinical trial, which is post-marketing surveillance. If you remember, we have done this in PSM. Yeah, so this is all about anti-epileptic drugs. Now let's do the questions here. So what is the drug of choice for focal seizure? Remember, it is carbamazepine, but because in elderly we have very high risk of SJH and SIADH, in elderly the drug which is preferred is lamotrigine. Again, for trigeminal neuralgia, carbamazepine is the drug of choice. For typical absence seizure, we have done, it is T-channel blocker, ethosuximide. For absence atypical seizures, we are gonna have valproate. Alright, when you don't find anything, you go for valproate. Infantile spasm alone, I and vowel stick together, that is ACTH. But when you have infantile spasm in association with tuberous sclerosis, then you wanna give vigabatrin. Okay. For neonatal seizure, it is phenobarb. We've also seen this in pediatrics. Febrile seizures, it is diazepam, which is the first line drug. In status epilepticus, it is lorazepam, which is the first line drug. And the benzodiazepine approved in LGS is clobazam. Alright, so these are your 3 benzodiazepines that you want to remember. As far as GTCS, JME, LGS, so any syndromes you want to remember, it is valproate, which is the drug of choice. Alright, so when in doubt, you mark valproate. Whereas in pregnancy, never mark valproate unless the female is already on valproate. So if the seizures are well controlled on valproate, do not stop if that line is mentioned. But otherwise, if you want to start in pregnancy, either you go for levetiracetam or lamotrigine. Okay, so these are the two drugs, two L's, which are safe in pregnancy. Last topic, we want to do spinal cord tracts. So we have these three main spinal tracts that we have. So the first two are your sensory tracts. So you can see how they are carrying the sensation into the primary somatosensory cortex. So look at this tract, which is decussating directly at the spinal cord and then ascending contralaterally into thalamus and then going to the sensory cortex. This is spinothalamic tract, carries pain and temperature. Alright, so you want to remember lateral spinothalamic is PLT, pain, temperature and lateral. On the other hand, if you see, it ascends ipsilaterally and then decussates at medulla and then rises as medial lemniscus. These are your dorsal columns. Dorsal columns have two parts, they ascend as two parts. They ascend as fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus. Gracilis, remember, gracious legs. So gracilis is lower body and legs, cuneatus is U for upper body and arms. The legs, the gracilis fibers are medial, whereas cuneatus fibers are laterally arranged in the spinal cord. Alright, so this is how they are arranging, and they are carrying your proprioception, vibration, crude touch. So that is all the things that dorsal columns are carrying. On the other hand, your motor fibers from the primary motor cortex, they cross at the medulla, pyramidal decussation, and then they are gonna course into the cord, go to the anterior horn cells, and via the neuromuscular junction, they reach the muscle. So this is your corticospinal tracts. These are your main lateral corticospinal tracts that we have. Okay, so here let's look at how they are arranged in a cross section of the cord. So these are your dorsal columns posteriorly, as you can see. These are your lateral spinothalamic tracts. Look at how closely they are with the central canal. So anytime you have central canal enlargement like a syrinx, they are first gonna go and involve the spinothalamic. That to what spinothalamic? It's gonna be the medial cervical spinothalamic, and that is why you have a cape-like loss of pain and temperature, upper body loss of pain and temperature in syringomyelia. So this actually helps you understand this presentation. And here you have your lateral corticospinal tract. So you can see again the cervical are closer to the midline. So except for the dorsal columns, the cervical are closer to the midline. So now let's look at the different lesions here. Most frequently asked in the exam is this hemisection. What if the cord gets cut in half? This half is not working. How will you have the lesions? So if you have a lesion on the right side, at the level of the lesion, you're gonna lose all sensations on the same side with element sign, because for that level your anterior horn cell is your lower motor neuron. Understand this concept of LMN and UMN. LMN means anything from the level of anterior horn cell. If you have a cut there, you will have a lower motor neuron palsy, meaning you're gonna have flaccid paralysis, you're gonna have areflexia, you can have fasciculations. On the other hand, upper motor neuron, if you have a lesion in the corticospinal tract, the kind of lesion that you're gonna have is spastic paralysis. You're gonna have a clasp knife rigidity. You're gonna have DTRs which are markedly raised. So this is LMN versus UMN. Babinski is gonna be up in UMN. Alright, so this is LMN versus UMN. So at that level of the lesion, everything is gonna be LMN. All sensations are gonna be lost on the same side. What is very important is what happens below. So ipsilateral, what you want to remember is dorsal column, corticospinal, because both of them are decussating at the medulla. Remember, at the cord level you are going to have ipsilateral loss below that level. Alright, so you have upper motor neuron signs and dorsal column loss ipsilaterally, whereas pain, temperature and touch is contralateral. I hope this is clear. Spinothalamic, contralateral loss, ipsilateral for corticospinal and dorsal column. Okay, so this is what is the Brown-Séquard syndrome. This is what is most frequently tested. Others we just have to identify. If I tell you the orange areas are the ones which are affected, what is the condition? So here you can see how the anterior 2/3 of the cord is not working. So this is what is seen in an anterior spinal artery infarct. You're gonna have this half of the anterior part. So the only thing you're gonna have is preservation of dorsal column. So that is your buzzword. If proprioception vibration is preserved, that's ASA infarct. If you have dorsal columns which are involved with the dorsal root ganglion, this is what is tabes dorsalis. Tabes dorsalis is a manifestation of tertiary syphilis, neurosyphilis. So here you're gonna have loss of joint position proprioception. You're gonna have lancinating pain because of the ganglion getting affected. You're gonna have Argyll-Robertson pupil. If you remember from Ophthal, Argyll-Robertson syphilis hai, so you remember accommodates but does not react, yeah. So this is tabes dorsalis. When you see central canal is expanded, this is syringomyelia. Remember, there is going to be a cape-like distribution of loss of pain and temperature. So the person is not going to feel anything around the shoulders and the upper limbs because it's the cervical spinothalamic tracts which are involved first. And when you see dorsal columns plus corticospinal, this is subacute spinal cord degeneration. This is frequently seen with B12 deficiency, can also be seen with copper deficiency and HIV. So again, you're going to have loss of joint position in addition to spastic paralysis. If you have only anterior horn cell getting affected, so you have a flaccid paralysis, but it is asymmetrical. So acute flaccid paralysis, infective cause, what is it? It is poliomyelitis. On the other hand, if bilateral symmetrical anterior horn cells are affected, you are gonna have lower motor neuron palsy only. This is known as SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, or Wernicke-Hoffmann disease. Okay, so this is when you have a very floppy baby, called as a floppy baby, because bilateral anterior horn cells are gone, only lower motor neuron. On the other hand, UMN plus LMN, this is your buzzword. When you have UMN plus LMN, what we are dealing with is Lou Gehrig's disease or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So here you're going to have a mixture of both. Very, very important treatment thanks to Stephen Hawking. We all know the treatment here. It is riluzole, which is an NMDA inhibitor, or you can have a new drug, that is edaveron. Alright, so remember these two drugs for ALS. So this is about the cord lesions that you also want to know the pattern approach for. If you don't remember anything, remember ipsilateral DC and CS, whereas contralateral spinothalamic, because SIR and SIR stick together here. Not C and C, but C and SIR stick together. Okay, so this is all about neurology. I hope this is useful to you. It is one of my personal favorite systems, and I hope you get a lot of questions from what we've discussed. Thank you so much.